April 1998. I'm still working at Frame Art Galleries. Of course, it's just my second month there, and I'll be there for 7 years. So you're going to hear about frame art quite a bit. Still hanging out with Jane and reading a wide variety of books. I think you can help me determine if you think this is a good mix of different types of books. We're going to jump right in. The first book that I read in April of 1998 was Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert A. Heinlein, a classic of science fiction. And this is the story of Valentine Michael Smith, who is a human who was raised by Martians. And he's never encountered another human until he goes to Earth, thus being the stranger in a strange land. And as he's learning the customs of Earth, thought I felt a sneeze coming on. As he's learning the customs of Earth, he's sharing essentially the customs of Mars. And I think, if I remember correctly, he becomes sort of a prophet or a religious figure. You know, he might change the way that humans on Earth think and live. I think. Not a huge fan of Heinlein. I know he's considered a master of science fiction. There are people that just love his stuff. This was one that I enjoyed, possibly the most. It's probably between this and Starship Troopers, but still wasn't enough to make me a huge fan. I wasn't running out to read his stuff. In fact, this might be the last one that I ever read by him. But let's move on to the next book, which is Fear Nothing by Dean Koontz. So this was recommended, lent to me by Jane, and I read it in a day. And this is the first in what was supposed to be a trilogy, but I don't think the third book has ever come out. And it's about a guy named Christopher Snow who has this rare disease, and light hurts him, essentially. A real disease. So he lives his life at night and in the darkness. And I have another note. Oh, it's in Moonlight Bay. So it's the Moonlight Bay. It's supposed to be the Moonlight Bay trilogy. So Christopher Snow goes to visit his father in the hospital. And his father tells him to fear nothing and then dies. And then Christopher accidentally sees that his father's body is swapped with the body of a homeless man. And then Christopher gets chased, and then it becomes this thing. He's trying to figure out what's going on, and bad guys keep coming after him. And there's a military base and weird animals and interesting adventure. Since it was meant to be a trilogy, a lot of stuff is left unanswered. It all takes place in 24 hours, and overnight, essentially, less than 24 hours, I would say. If I had known this, I would have actually stayed up and read it all night, just sort of for the fun of reading it while it's happening or during the time frame that it's happening. You know what I mean? But I didn't realize that, so I actually slept at night and read it during the day. That's neither here nor there. I believe that this is the last Dean Koontz book I ever read until last year when I read the novelization of The Funhouse, because this wasn't enough to make me a Koontz fan again. But I think it was okay. I never read the sequel, obviously. And as I said, I don't think the third book has ever come out. Then I read Son of Fletch by Gregory MacDonald. And in this book, there are 4 escaped convicts in Fletch's neighborhood. One of them shows up at his door, and I don't remember at what point it's essentially revealed. I'm not spoiling anything. It's in the title that this person is Fletch's son that he never knew he had. And they get in, and at first, Fletch is disturbed by how his son turned out, but then there's some twists and turns. There's not really a central mystery, just some stuff that's going on. That sounds bad. Which this is one of my favorite of the Fletch books, but I'm trying to think of how to say things without spoiling anything, because if you're into this stuff, you should read it. Yeah, so Fletch's son is not who he appears to be when we first meet him. Maybe that'll tease people. Really, really good book. I'm a fan. I've read it more than once. And if you want to know what the twist is, we can talk about it down in the comments with spoiler warnings and such. But Son of Fletch, one of my favorite in the Fletch series. Then I read, so I think right off the bat, we got a good mix. We got some science fiction, we got some horror, and we've got a mystery thriller kind of thing. I don't know exactly what category Son of Fletch would fall into. And then we have The Crow, Quoth the Crow, by David Bishop. Never exactly sure how to say his name. This is, I don't know if this was the first one. There was a whole series of, I think this was the first one, because this says forthcoming and lists a couple others. A whole series of novels based on The Crow by James O'Barr, the comic book, and then the movie, both of which are fantastic. This was a gift from Jane, and she inscribed it, and I can actually show you because it does not show her real name. But there, 11/14/97. So this may have been a birthday gift. It says for Dom, which was me. When I was in high school, junior high, I liked to use the name Dominic Fortune, which is a comic book character, really cool. One of my favorite comic book characters, created by Howard Chaykin. And since Jane and I were exchanging, getting to know each other, exchanging anecdotes from earlier in our lives, from before we met, she went with the whole Dominic Fortune thing. I think she found that funny. But it says, for Dom, now don't get all morbid with Edgar Allan Poe shit. Oh, and by the way, just because, and it's signed Flint, because, man, everything comes back to comic books. I thought she had kind of pointy elbows, and I said it reminded me of these characters, the Grackle Flints from Matt Wagner's Mage comic book. And so I started calling her Flint. So anyway, this is about the main character, do we have his name? William Blessing, who is the best-selling horror author, and he's a scholar, sort of obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe. And stuff happens. He ends up murdered. His wife is raped and beaten. And a raven, as opposed to a crow, of course, brings him back to life so he can get revenge. It's a crow story. If you're familiar with The Crow, you know how it goes. But very, very interesting. I think if you're a fan of Edgar Allan Poe, each chapter has an Edgar Allan Poe quote, or quote from a story, or a writing of Edgar Allan Poe. Very gothic, very dark. Pretty good, I think. But if you're a fan of The Crow, this whole series of novels, I think is pretty good. Interesting takes from different authors on the whole sort of Crow mythos. And I followed that up with, I forgot to read the back of this to say exactly, to see exactly what the story was. But this is Star Trek The Next Generation / X-Men Planet X. I dig that cover. Michael Jan Friedman is the author. Let's see what it's about. On the planet Zaldia, ordinary men and women are mutating into bizarre creatures with extraordinary powers. But is this a momentous evolutionary leap or an unparalleled catastrophe? The very fabric of Zaldian society is threatened as fear and prejudice divide the transformed from their own kin. Sounds like the X-Men. Dispatched to cope with the growing crisis, Captain Picard and the crew of the Starship Enterprise receive some unexpected visitors from another reality in the form of the group of mutant heroes known as the Uncanny X-Men. Storm, leader of the X-Men, offers their help in resolving a situation that is agonizingly similar to the human-mutant conflicts of their own time and space. But when hostile aliens appear in orbit around Zaldia to try and abduct the transformed for use as a superpowered force in an attack on the Federation, even the combined forces of the crew of the Starfleet and the X-Men may be unable to prevent an inferno of death and destruction. Starfleet's finest crew and Earth's greatest mutant heroes will need all their powers and abilities to save the Zaldian people and stop a deadly threat to the Federation. So there you go. Now, I believe there was a comic book crossover that was the original Star Trek series crossed over with the X-Men. And so when the X-Men show up, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments below, but when the X-Men show up on the Enterprise, they don't recognize the people, but they recognize that they are once again in the Star Trek universe, I think. But a lot of fun. I'm a fan of Star Trek. I'm somewhat a fan of the X-Men, depending on who's writing them and which characters. They're not my favorite team. You've heard me say this before. But this is a lot of fun. I'm happy to have this. It's one I'm going to reread relatively soon, maybe. I don't know. I always say that. I have so much to read. But good stuff. And Michael Jan Friedman is an author of a lot of Star Trek novels, if I'm not mistaken. But Star Trek The Next Generation, X-Men, Planet X. Then, that's it for the books I actually still own. Then we have Dark Destiny, and I've written down World of Darkness, edited by Edward E. Kramer. This is an anthology that is sort of set in the World of Darkness from White Wolf, which was Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse. They had some magic characters. So White Wolf Publishing made all these role-playing games. I just named some. And they were publishing books set in those worlds. And I think they wanted to sort of branch out away from just gamers and sort of get other people's eyes on their stuff. And so they put this out, and it's 22 stories, and you've got authors like Harlan Ellison, Robert Bloch, Nancy A. Holder, some pretty big names. I believe, from what I read, that this was Robert Bloch's last published story, and some of the stories I think are set firmly in the whole World of Darkness that White Wolf created. Some just sort of hint that they're part of that world, and then I think there are a few that don't necessarily say that they're, intimate that they're not in that world, but don't do anything to indicate that they are in that world. It's just a bunch of horror stories with vampires, werewolves, mages, sorcerers, wizards, whatever you want to call them, in the modern world. Although World of Darkness does encompass some Dark Ages stuff too, so I'm not sure when everything is set. Anyway, It's an anthology of horror stories. It's pretty good. Um, excuse me. Then we have Nightlife, Night with a K, Nightlife by Peter David. This is the first in a trilogy. I think there's at least 3 in this series, and essentially it's about King Arthur reincarnated in modern day New York, where he decides to run for mayor. Merlin is there, and Mordred and what's her name? Morgana Le Fay are there to oppose him. It's Peter David, who I'm a huge fan of, wrote a lot of Star Trek stuff, but big, huge comic book writer, and wrote a lot of original novels. Well, I guess it depends on what you consider a lot. More than I ever have. This is a fun book. I like he tends to put a little twist on things when he's writing them. His werewolf novel about a wolf that's bitten by a werewolf and so becomes human on the full moon. A lot of fun. Now we have the whole Arthurian legend kind of thing, but thrown into modern day New York. And it's good, fun, modern fantasy stuff. And then finally, the last book that I read in April of 1998 was Savage Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is the 7th, I believe, and final Pellucidar book, and it's actually 4 stories. One, I think, was discovered posthumously. Not 100% sure about that. But I know 3 of them were previously published in, fantasy magazines and stuff. And then the other one was found in a vault or something. But it's just 4 stories with David Innes, Abner Perry, in Pellucidar, the world hidden in the middle of the earth. The earth is hollow, Pellucidar's inside. There's a sun in the middle of it. So there's never night in Pellucidar. It's always day. Because where's the sun going to go when it's inside a globe? Prehistoric creatures, wild monsters, and just 4 fun, pulpy adventure stories. And I may have a copy of this. I have a Pellucidar book up there on the shelf, but it's underneath like 30, 40 books. I didn't feel like digging it out. If it's even the one. I didn't even bother to check because I knew I wasn't going to dig it out. But that's it. That is everything I read in April of 1998. As I said, I think it's a crazy mix. You got some pulp. You got a little bit of modern fantasy. More horror than anything else, but some sci-fi, some comic book stuff thrown in. Mystery, adventure, whatever you want to call Son of Fletch. Yeah, not a bad month. And still hanging out with Jane. But, that's not going to last forever. Let's see. Do I have a question? How about... Have I asked this before? What property, and I guess we'll go with movies. I suppose it could be TV as well. We'll say movies. What movie or TV property would you like to see, or would you be interested in reading novels about? I feel like I've really asked this before because I know I've talked about this kind of thing because I just glanced over. I can see a bunch of the Alien and Aliens books that I have and Firefly. But maybe this has changed. And I'm not talking about novelizations. That's a whole different thing that we can talk about sometime. But just what property would most interest you, something that you really like. And in this case, with The Crow, there was just one movie. Bunch of comic books. but I think more people are aware of the movie. And then they did 3 or 4 or 5 novels and a short story collection. So, of course, again, since I just thought of this question, oh, what property would I want to see a series of books about? Now, the nice thing about The Crow is that, I guess it's a double-edged sword with The Crow. You can have all new characters, all new types of settings, because it's about the crow and the revenge thing and the coming back from death, which is the sort of the bad side of the double-edged sword, because essentially every story is about somebody dying and coming back for revenge. So it's a but of course I like that. I think the authors put different twists on how it all worked, what they did, but there is an essential bare bones structure that they're going to have to use. But then within that structure, they can do pretty much anything, which was kind of good. Oh, cripes. I stumped myself. I'm trying to think of different things. You know what? I would love to see. Well, I don't know if it would work. I was going to say Chainsaw Sally. There's a couple of movies, a couple seasons of a TV show that was on the internet. I'm not sure if it would be sustainable because she's a villain or an anti-hero. I kind of see her as the Punisher, although much more psychotic. More like there was a very short storyline where the Punisher went absolutely crazy and was killing jaywalkers and litterers. Like, if anybody broke the tiniest law, the Punisher would go after them. And that's sort of Chainsaw Sally. I love the Chainsaw Sally stuff. I would love to have much, much more. I just don't know if it would be sustainable as a series of books. Well, maybe if I think of an answer, I'll talk about it in the comments or something. A better answer. So, I don't know. I stumped myself. Maybe you won't be able to come up with anything either. I have a headache, so my brain's not working at 100%. I'm going to use that as my excuse for not thinking of an answer. But anyway, all right. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you have any comments, questions, or corrections, please put those in the comments below. Comments are open for spoilers. Just post a spoiler warning. We try to be polite here on my channel. Please like, share, and subscribe. All the usual YouTube stuff. If you'd care to follow me on other social media, my Twitter, for the time being, is Ronan, at Ronan5757. My Instagram, where I post pictures of books, comic books, board games, and fuzzy animals, is Eric Smith5757. That's Eric with a K. ERIKSMITH5757. That's all I have for you this week. So until next week, read more books.